I grew up believing that families were fortresses, solid, dependable walls built of shared jokes, shared recipes, and shared secrets. But the day I found the photographs hidden in our guest room drawer, I realized that what we had built was a house of cards balanced on loyalties that could be bought. With silence, the photographs were not artful or staged. They were small, candid things. Two blurred smiles, a hand on a hip, a hotel keycard with a name I knew too well, and the air in my chest went thin and cold, as if someone had taken a straw out of my lungs and left me to breathe through my teeth. Because the man in those photographs was my husband and the woman laughing beside him was my sister, the girl I had bandaged at 7 after she fell from the mango tree and who had once tucked me into bed when I caught my first fever. I folded the pictures like I was closing a wound and held them under the cereal box until the anger arrived like a storm front, sudden and enormous. And then the first rational thing I did was drive to my father's house because the thought of confronting my husband first tasted like raw metal. And the thought of confronting my sister first tasted like ash. My father was an anchor in my life, the person whose hand steadied me through bad report cards and worse breakups. The man who called every Sunday at 6 sharp to ask about the weather and my cholesterol. Hey. And when I arrived at his small bungalow with its dented mailbox and the hibiscus bush that refused to be tamed, the house smelled the way home always smells. Lemon-scented detergent and something sweet in the oven. I knocked 3 times, and when he opened the door, his face arranged itself into that familiar mask of irritation and affection, the one he wore when I borrowed his tools and returned them blunt. Thump. And I saw, as if for the first time, the lines at the corners of his eyes and the slow stoop of his shoulders, and I realized that the man who had always seemed invincible could be pressed into silence, just like the rest of us. I told him about the photographs, showed him the edges where the glossy paper still shone, and his expression did not fracture into the outrage I wanted. Instead, he blinked, looked beyond me as if tallying some cost on the other side of the room, and said quietly, almost apologetically, I knew. The words were not a confession, they were a verdict. I felt my world compress into those 2 syllables. I knew. I wanted to scream and ask how long and when and why and who else knew, but all at once a colder calculation took hold. If my father had known and kept the secret, then he had been choosing a daughter over a marriage, choosing to protect the person he loved most at the expense of the person he had sworn to love another way. And the rawness of that knowledge split me open in places I didn't know I had. He said, not to protect her, then stopped as if even that phrase demanded more explanation than he could give. To protect the family. He spoke of preservation as if it were an ethic, and his voice trembled not with shame but with a weary defense of an entire lifetime of choices. And I saw then that men like him keep secrets the way builders lay rafters, to keep the roof from caving in, to keep the children from seeing the cold. But the roof did cave in. The roof had never been stronger. It had just been covering rot. My first instinct was not revenge. At first, there was only the slow animal unspooling of grief and disbelief, the way grief unhooks your appetite so that even the smell of coffee becomes an intrusion. I slept in the car for 2 nights because the idea of our bed that had the imprint of 2 bodies after dreaming felt polluted. I watched him move around the apartment as if he were a ghost in his own life, and when I finally confronted him, the anger that came out of me sounded like a machine, loud and efficient. He said the same things men always say when trapped in a lie. It was a mistake. It was a moment of weakness. It meant nothing. My sister said she was sorry and cried with a sharpness that felt like practiced sorrow, like a professional apologizer who learned the right tone. Later I would discover that her remorse had its own rhythm, and that it sometimes curdled into a stranger's pity. My father called me after I had packed a small bag and left a note on the kitchen counter that said only, I need air. And his voice was the sound of someone balancing equations. One life versus another, consequence versus protection. And he asked me to come home, to sit down, to listen. I thought of returning for the sake of closure, but feared my presence would be an uninvited accelerant to a family performance, one more person for them to play innocent to. Revenge did not strike me as poetic until I had time to think like a person who had been wronged. Revenge, I decided, had to be proportionate, precise, and, above all, final. I could have called him names in public, smeared his reputation on social media, or screamed the details to friends until my voice grew hoarse. But that would have been feeding the wind with the sort of heat that leaves scorch marks but no change in structure. Instead, I chose methods that unspooled their effects slowly, that tightened like a noose built of legal logic and social truth. I was a small, tidy fury with a calculator. I read our prenuptial agreement. An irony, perhaps, because prenuptials are supposed to keep people sane before they are not, and discovered a clause about joint investments that he had neglected to disclose. I opened the thick, dusty file of our shared financials and found negligence, hidden accounts, and a pattern of expenditures labeled as a business that were personal. My husband had always been good at smiling with numbers. He had been less careful about the ledger when it came to the nights he spent elsewhere. I went to a lawyer with a face like ice and a no-nonsense binder and asked about dissolution in financial forensic accounting, and the women in the office, efficient and sympathetic, began to draw me a map of how to translate betrayal into legal consequence. Somewhere between the bank subpoenas and the quiet, professional shock on our accountant's face, the affair became something visible. Transfers labeled as a consulting, nights at hotels booked in my name, cash withdrawals timed after family dinners. I learned to watch my husband's face as a geographer learns to read a coastline, where it curved toward guilt, where it flattened in denial. And I learned to get angry in ways that left no bruises but turned assets into evidence. But revenge without narrative is just calculation, and I was greedy for story. I wanted the world to understand not only that I had been wronged, but the manner of the wrong, the betrayals, the complicity, the secret sharing that had made my father an accomplice. I began to write. The first draft was a letter I never sent. I wrote about mornings with him that felt like small mercies, about grocery lists folded like origami, about the peculiar intimacy of shared shyness. I wrote about my sister's laugh and how it had used to be a bomb. And then I wrote, with a pen that finally felt righteous, about the photographs and the sterile hotel room light and the names on credit card receipts. I placed copies of that letter in strategic envelopes addressed to two people, the family lawyer and the oldest friend of my husband, the one who had been at our wedding and who still posted pictures of sunsets with captions about true love. But I also printed a copy and slid it into the envelope for my father. I wanted him to read the words in his own hand, to feel the heat of exposure that he had kept from me. He read them with hands that trembled, and then, because he always did, he phoned me and said simple things about better times, about the necessity of keeping the family intact, and his voice was like a small white flag. He begged in the language of habitual peacemakers, and in that plea I heard the real confession. Not that he had wanted to hurt me, but that he had been frightened of losing the person who had raised him. He had made a trade that favored the daughter who needed social protection over the daughter whose marriage he had promised to honor. And in his calculus I was an expendable variable. The old anger rose hot and bright, but I had a spreadsheet now, and spreadsheets teach patience. Revenge is a slow cultivation of evidence, but it also requires an arena, and mine was small-town civility, church committees, town meetings, the volunteer networks where reputations clink like fine china. I began to release my version of the story in increments that were impossible to ignore. A whisper here, an anonymously mailed ledger to the right person there, a well-timed question in a community meeting. Has anyone noticed discrepancies in the charity's financials? That sent the treasurer scrambling. People looked at him differently when numbers became public. They looked at my sister differently when friends began to murmur about boundaries and betrayal. I made sure my actions never collapsed into crude public spectacle. Instead, I aimed for elegant catastrophe, for a dismantling that took place in the light of polite Sunday lunches and the quiet hum of household chatter. The thing about small towns is that they love narratives that confirm the worst about trusted men. They also love sudden reversals. When the accountant called an audit and the auditors found evidence of falsified records and illicit transfers, The shock on faces that had once been kind made my stomach lurch with a complicated mix of triumph and sorrow. He had built a carefully cultivated image of integrity that was only ever a suit over a hollow chest, and witnessing the public unbuttoning of that suit felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and watching the old landscape dissolve. Even as I administered the legal and social dismantling, I watched myself change. Revenge, I learned, can be addictive in small doses. It is like salt. Once you begin, you keep tasting for more. The days after the audits were mechanical. Depositions, meetings, interviews. Wildfires of accusation do not burn neatly. They scorch leaves far from the starting point. My sister fell into a private collapse. Where she had once been brash and radiant, she became a small animal, ashamed and wandering about our family home as if the walls themselves had turned away. She would come to me sometimes, voice raw, asking for absolution, and I discovered that revenge has a strange interior life. There are moments where you regret the part of yourself that takes pleasure in another's fall, because even when the fall is deserved, it is still a human body hitting the earth. Once late at night, she knocked on my door, and we sat on the floor of my kitchen with 2 cups of tea that had gone cold, and she said, "I thought I was in love." And I had to decide whether to believe her. She offered stories of loneliness, of whispered promises, of being convinced that she was the center of some grand affection. Whether any of that was true mattered less than the fact that she had made the choice. I told her that the measure of character is not the original sin, but the response to the sin, the way one squares oneself afterward, and she wept as if she had finally been given a map back to a shore. The father, my father, was a knot that unraveled last. His attempts at reconciliation were clumsy and generous in equal measure. He promised to make restitution in ways that did not touch money, because some debts are not financial. He scrubbed the guest room where I had found the photographs until his fingers bled and planted a new row of hibiscus to apologize without words. In private, he confessed to me that he had been afraid of losing his daughter to scandal, because in our world scandal had teeth. He had feared for her safety in a way that was ultimately selfish. He had been living under a superstition that family reputation could be preserved by denying the storm, but storms that are denied only grow angry and uncontainable. He offered to leave the house, literal exile, a symbolic gesture of penitence, but I refused. Exile would have given him a badge of martyrdom, whereas the work he needed to do was to stay and rebuild in view of the people he had hurt. He began to volunteer at the thrift shop, to attend counseling. And sometimes in off moments, he would call me not to ask for favors, but to ask about my day. Those calls, small and mundane, were the first scaffolding of a new, honest relationship. Retribution satisfied some hunger, but did not fill the hollows left by betrayal. There were nights when the apartment felt like a stage cleared of props, our lives stripped down to their bare beams, and I found solace in small, stubborn acts of self-care. I took up running because endurance is a form of prayer. I learned to cook properly, turning recipes into rituals of care for myself. I read books that had nothing to do with revenge or law or family, and which reminded me that my life was wide enough to hold other stories. With time, the world resumed its usual gestures of kindness. Coworkers asked me about vacation plans, neighbors waved, the woman at the dry cleaners no longer tilted her head when I walked in. My identity had been tested and in the crucible reformed. I was not the same person who had once believed love would always be reciprocal and quiet. I learned to delimit my generosity and to spot the flattering voice that masks selfishness. I learned also to accept help from people I had once thought trivial, friends who cooked soup, a neighbor who fixed my fence, a barista who remembered my name. Revenge, though, has consequences of its own. When your life becomes proof that one person can be unmasked, others begin to fear being next. There are costs to being the one who lifts the veil. Friends choose sides, certain doors close, and the quiet dignity I had once valued becomes complicated by the knowledge that dignity can be weaponized. My husband lost his job, which in a way satisfied something primitive in me, but it also made him small in ways that made me feel queasy. The man I had once loved reduced to a man who could not pay bills. I did not relish the sight. I observed it as if cataloging damage. My sister moved away for a while, then came back, older in a way that was not about age but about the accrual of regret. She married later to someone who liked to plant gardens. Sometimes she sent me pictures of roses she had coaxed into bloom, and I felt the odd pang of gratitude that some part of her still reached for beauty. There was one final act of revenge, if you can call it that, I did not plan. It arose from the small human desire to be seen, to have the truth registered in the ledger of public judgment. At a community event, a charity fundraiser where all of our faces were well known, my husband planned to make a speech, to return to that stage where charm could mend what secrecy had broken. I learned of it because small towns have ears. Someone told me a week in advance. I did not intend to humiliate him publicly, but I also did not intend to let him take the stage unchallenged. On the day, I arrived early, wearing a dress that made me feel like myself rather than a weapon. The hall smelled of coffee and candles, and the same people who had once smiled at my husband sat eating chicken and nodding. He stepped up to the mic with that old practiced ease and began to speak about community and integrity. And I realized in that instant that my revenge had come fully into being not when the auditors found discrepancies or when the credit cards were exposed, but when people began to reconcile their image of him with the person standing at the podium. This is the slow violence of truth. I stood up. I told one brief truth about honesty, about the price of silence, about the cost of keeping a beloved daughter's misdeeds in the dark while the rest of us were made to live a lie. My words were not long. They did not need to be. They landed like a single bell tolling in a cathedral. There was a silence like a held breath, then murmurs, then the complicated music of people choosing sides. He tried to speak over me, to reclaim narrative, but the audience had already shifted. Some looked ashamed for him, some looked injured for me. The humiliation that followed was immediate, the slow cooling of applause, the way people averted their eyes. But I felt none of the triumph I had imagined. Instead, what rose in me was a fierce, clear sorrow that had nothing to do with winning and everything to do with cost. Because truth, like fire, does not only burn the liar, it burns everyone who stands too near. In the years that followed, our family became a different sort of thing. We did not return to the easy warmth of before. That was gone, irretrievable. Instead, we built from the ruins. My father found a new humility that made him less domineering and more present. He began to ask questions instead of making pronouncements. My sister chastened, reinvented herself into someone quieter and more deliberate. She became a teacher and would later tell her students, with a frankness that made teenagers listen, that mistakes do not define you unless you let them. My ex-husband remarried in haste to someone who did not know his history. Gossip is a river that cuts new channels. I remarried only in the respect that I married the life I wanted, not another person. I married my work, my friends, my small, stubborn garden in the backyard where roses grew in spite of everything. There were moments more than you might think, when I regretted the way my revenge had hurt others beyond the circle of the intended. I regretted the way my father's health seemed to fold into itself as the scandal gnawed at him, how his hair whitened in patches, and how once his hands shook as he ate. As he placed a cup on the table. But regret taught me compassion in a new orientation, compassion for myself and for the frailty of others who have the power to wound. Sometimes on slow nights I read the old letter I had never sent to him and to her and to my father. I read it not to reopen wounds, but to remind myself how sharp the edges once were, how white-hot the anger that made me rational, strategic, and hard. I do not romanticize revenge now. It is a dangerous animal. It eats as much of you as it eats of the target. What I learned, through audits in courtroom lobbies and tearful conversations on worn sofas, is that the real work after betrayal is repair, of self, of family, of the small civic bonds that make community possible. That repair required setting boundaries, saying no when people expected otherwise, and learning to love in ways that were less about possession and more about mutual dignity. I learned also that truth must be named because silence corrodes. The rot that secrecy breeds will not stay secret forever, and sometimes, to keep what is left of a life intact, you must let the rot be seen so that it can be excised. There is a final, quieter revenge that I cherish now, one that is almost domestic and thoroughly healing. It is the way I learned to reclaim small joys as if I were stealing them back from a thief. I would wake early and run along the river where the city hummed awake, and I would watch fishermen cast nets into the silver light and feel, absurdly, like an accomplice to the world's slow, ordinary kindness. I planted an orange tree that grew stubborn and wise in my yard, and in summer I would pick its fruit and press the juice against the rim of a glass and think about how bitter sweetness can coexist in one mouth. When my sister visited and we sat on my back porch watching a sunset, we did not pretend the past had not happened. We acknowledged it like weather and then moved on, because nothing undoes a human life faster than the refusal to go on. My father died years later of something small and inevitable, an artery that chose to betray him. And at his funeral, I spoke not of crimes or failures, but of the complicated, messy ways that love insists on itself. In that speech, I forgave him in the only way that mattered, by continuing to live honestly, by refusing to trade my life for the comforting lie of silence. If revenge is a dish, then it is not the satisfying dessert I once imagined. It is a bitter stew that warms you in the moment but leaves residue. The true victory was quieter. I learned to make a life in which betrayal did not define me. I learned to be fiercely gentle with the people who deserved it and uncompromising with those who would make a career of exploiting tenderness. I learned to measure my actions not by the immediate sting they would cause, but by the long arc of consequence that would follow. And when I look back on those photographs tucked under the cereal box, I do not see only the betrayal. I see a map of the trouble we all can cause one another and the work it takes to repair what we break. My sister and I, older and softer, now exchange recipes instead of accusations. We tend a small garden that one summer yielded more tomatoes than we knew what to do with. Then we joked that we had finally grown something honest. My father kept his secret to protect his beloved daughter, and in protecting her he broke another daughter. But in the end, what remained was not just the wreckage, but the careful, imperfect work of rebuilding. Apologies that were not performative but slow. Restitution that came in patient gestures, and the hard, lifelong practice of choosing truth over comfort. Revenge had its moments, sharp and necessary, but forgiveness, earned, not given, became the longer, more radical act. And that has, in the end, been the sweetest and most surprising form of triumph I could imagine.